see that guy right there? I know what you're thinking. How in the world did he get into this mess? Well, it's quite simple, really. I just happen to think the remake of Resident Evil 3 is terrible. I suppose I should clarify my opinion. I did have fun with the game. However, just because I had fun with the game, that does not mean that it's good. All hyperbole aside, for what we got, I'd have to say that the game kinda doesn't live up to the expectations, especially considering the brilliance that was Resident Evil 2 remakes from last year, followed up with Devil May Cry 5 and Mega Man 11 that came prior to that. It finally seemed that Capcom had discarded the dreaded Crapcom moniker. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. What is Resident Evil 3? Well, it's a remake from an older game, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, where you play as Jill Valentine, back to being a brunette from the weird choice of making her to look like Samus knockoff from Resident Evil 5. Seriously, I can't be the one who sees that she looks insanely like Samus. Even has the blue jumpsuit that's skin tight.
Oh no, that is so fucking stupid. That is so fucking stupid.
But odd perviness aside, you play as Jill trying to escape from Raccoon City, which has been overrun by a near infinite amount of zombies and mysterious life form called Nemesis. I know I just basically compounded the plot into a bite-sized chunk, but there's a good reason for that. I'm just trying to influence myself like the same with the game. Get the hell out of me. From a mechanics standpoint, as well as a scare factor, Resident Evil 3 actually is pretty solid. I'll happily admit the first time I got to face against Nemesis, he did scare me, and as my girlfriend will attest, when Nemesis decided to use its tentacles to latch onto me, that gave me a little extra adrenaline. The game looks good for the most part, but I have to have a caveat for that, since just because it looks good, it doesn't mean I don't have issues with the graphics and how Capcom went about this. I do love that there's a dodge mechanic for Jill now. Most sane people would instantly go to dodge an attacker should someone try to grab onto them. However, there's a cost to this that's no longer in the game as there was in Resident Evil 2, where in that game, once you got by a creature, you will take damage no matter what. There's no sub-weapons that you can use in order to stuff them into the maw of the creature that get their grubby little hands on you. So essentially it's like your typical anime convention, only a lot less scary since there's not the possibility of you getting slapped with a lawsuit because someone grabbed you. I do think that being able to dodge is a good compromise in that regard, since it adds more movement to the character and actually gives you the ability to get out of the line of damage, especially since you don't have to use resources for that. And now that we've got the positives out of the way, it's time to toss the game into the crapper. In which case, it's time for me to get the noose ready around my neck and say goodbye to the positive comment. Probably the biggest complaint I have with the game is with its length. Tons of journalists and reviewers have pointed out that the game is at best 6 hours long, and for a $60 price tag, I'm sorry, but that's simply unacceptable, especially in this day and age. Considering the fact there's a ton of assets that are ripped straight out of Resident Evil 2, that is also an issue. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a firm believer that a developer can reuse assets they've made in the past for future games. And we've seen games that are made with reused assets in a short amount of time that will still be met with critical acclaim. But more often than not, you'll find that a good portion of the zombies in the game are directly from Resident Evil 2. There's even a time where you'll go into Raccoon City Police Department as well and fight against 2 lickers. Yes, just 2 of them. And unlike Resident Evil 2, which had not only Claire and Leon's campaigns and you could go through twice in order to have 4 different runs, there's only one campaign here. And what's sad is there was potential to do what they did in Resident Evil 2. Another prominent character, Carlos, is in the game, and you get to play as him for about 2 segments, but you never use him against a boss character. Really, if you're going to reuse assets from a game and make the campaign be completable in less than 2 hours and not include other portions into the game, I think $60 is a pretty steep price. You shouldn't be able to complete a game in the same length that it takes to beat the original title, especially in this day and age. And people complain about Pokemon Sword and Shield. Now that I've effectively gotten the popular complaint out of the way and having successfully managed to pull this off without making the obvious dick length joke, I want to talk about the bosses in the game. Or technically, it's boss of the game. For a total of 4 times, you essentially fight the Nemesis. And 2 of those times are similar to each other, with the only exception being the location and how much more of a prominent tentacle that Nemesis now has to grab at you and slap that ass. Don't get me wrong, Nemesis is probably one of my favorite monsters in the Resident Evil franchise, second only to William Birkin, but the game could have done a bit more in diversity with the boss department. I'm not saying that Nemesis isn't a challenge, he certainly isn't as dumb as you can make him be in the original.
Hey, no biting. Hey, no biting.
But at least you got to fight Nemesis in other ways. Unarmed, with a missile launcher, fight against him with Carlos, fight him on the subway train. However, most of those fights are now regulated to being cutscenes, or you running away from Nemesis with no actual hope of actually damaging him. So it's patently bullshit. Capcom, what the hell are you doing? I thought we were past this emo phase where you pissed people off for acting like a little dink. This is especially terrible considering the great Resident Evil 2 that came out last year, or the Resident Evil remake that was made 18 years ago. Huh. In case you don't know, both of the previous remakes managed to not only bring those old games into the modern era at the time, but also brought new things to the table. Sure, they weren't one-for-one remasters of the original title, but in that case, they at least brought out new experiences that was worth your money. Shame I can't say the same thing about Resident Evil 3. Even that title that it came with it when I downloaded it, it really doesn't make it interesting for me. And it's a shame, since there would have been such an easy way to get around this. I already brought it up, but have Carlos have his own campaign, and do what you did with Resident Evil 2's remake. Have a story change depending on who you played first. In the original Resident Evil 3, Jill actually visited the Raccoon City Police Department and fought Nemesis there, but nope! That's not here. Not at all. I don't know, I feel as if the game is short. You could add more to the game. Also, why the hell does Carlos's alt costume just have his original haircut? Seriously, why is there a lack of costumes in the game? Well, enough slapping the salmon that is Capcom. Back to Resident Evil 3, I need to point out that I had a bit of an issue with Carlos' segments. Maybe this is on me, but one of the biggest things that the game doesn't tell you is that he doesn't even have a dodge. Rather, instead of dodging enemies, you smack them around. Oh gee, that's actually pretty cool. Shame that up to this point in the game I'd been using Jill all this time who dodges, so when I was using Carlos in these two segments, I used this as a means to dodge because the game didn't actually tell me this. It wasn't until I accidentally discovered this that I was able to use it properly. Yeah, I bitch slapped that hunter and saved myself, but that doesn't make this even acceptable. Again, maybe this is on me because, frankly, I am a certified idiot, but if instruction manuals aren't a thing anymore, and if a character is radically different than the one you've been playing up to this point in the game, maybe a little hint here and there wouldn't hurt. Ugh. So I talked about the reused assets that are in the game ripped from Resident Evil 2, which, again, isn't much of an issue. Or at least it wouldn't be, depending on how the price is. And I do have to say, though, there are new assets, and I do like what they did for the most part. And I know what I'm about to say is probably the biggest nitpicks I have ever said on this channel, and let me remind you, you're watching the channel that got big off of criticizing MatPat because he ignored little details in video games, so for me to admit that, that says something. I do not like Nemesis' redesign, and it's mostly due to the fact that he has a nose on his face. Yes, I know, that is probably the dumbest reason to dislike a character design, but hear me out. Nemesis has had a very consistent design ever since his debut. Even in the crossover games, Nemesis had a pretty consistent look to them. I don't know, the disfigured skin and pulled back mouth really added to the whole uncanny valley for me. It was a simple design really, but it was very unsettling, especially considering that when we were first introduced Nemesis, he was really the first enemy of his kind back in the day of survival horror. He could follow you into different locations, pretty much making it so you couldn't have a safe haven from him. He could use human weapons, making him be much more dangerous and versatile. And he also had the whole thing going on telling you, oh hell no! While this new version of Nemesis can be intimidating, seeing him up close with that twisted nose is just off-putting. It'd be like me taking the original Nemesis and slapping a big red clown nose on his face. It instantly doesn't make me want to take the thing seriously, and I'm getting the same vibe here. Again, that's probably just me. The thing about Resident Evil remakes prior to this one at least added something different and new to the table. The Resident Evil OG remake brought new monsters and brought up a much more graphical upgrade. Granted, I missed this line, Joseph! But the remake was awesome, and you can get it nowadays on widely available platforms. Resident Evil 2 offered multiple game modes, at best 4 different campaign modes that varied depending on who you were as the first character, and offered different perspectives on the story as well as having different final bosses for both of the characters. What I'm saying is, those games gave you your money worth. Resident Evil 3? Personally, I'd say stick with the original if you're able to stand tank controls, or stick with Resident Evil 2's remake. I cannot justify buying this game with that price tag on it, especially with the limited content in it. And even trying to get all the rewards doesn't really do it for me either, especially when I got things like Persona 5 Royale and Final Fantasy VII's remakes to go through instead. This was a really disappointing game, so I guess I'm destined to be stuck as a weeaboo for the rest of my life. Hooray!